Welcome to, as we enter the pointy end of Lent, into Holy Week and the Passion of Jesus, Damon from Wanaka. Lovely to have you in from Central. Gillian, welcome from St Hilda's Collegiate School. And Bishop Steve, lovely to have you as we break open the entrance into Jesus' city of Jerusalem. And I want to suggest that this is the Sunday where we seem to look for Jesus in the wrong place, but I'll see how you respond to all of that. Gillian, have you got some background on this pithy passage from Luke?
I do, actually. Funny you should say that. But I wanted to say that, this is where Jesus is finally arriving in Jerusalem. Since Luke chapter 9, Jesus has been on the journey towards Jerusalem and that whole travel narrative in Luke. And now he's finally got there. And it's like he's walked all this way and now he's going to ride on a horse, donkey, colt, whatever you're going to call it. And it's like, wow, okay, you're finally going to ride something. But anyway, it's obviously not because he was finally exhausted, but it's a symbolic gesture or symbolic, like a lived parable, an acted parable that he's doing here. And I think in terms of background, what's I think quite helpful is to consider, our Greco-Roman world in which these people were living and how the Roman or Greek military and victorious leaders would be given the honor of having a triumph, of entering the city of Rome or Jerusalem or wherever as these military conquering heroes and riding in a chariot drawn by white horses, wearing a laurel leaf crown with all the spoils of war and the captives of war all on display as they went into the city. And then once in the city, going to the temple to then offer sacrifices, perhaps to Jupiter or Zeus or whoever. And so with that kind of background, I think we have Jesus entering the city, and as I'm sure we'll talk about, riding on a borrowed donkey, ending up going to the temple to cleanse it rather than to make a sacrifice, and just all the, wearing a crown of thorns rather than a laurel crown, and all those kind of contrasts there, just to show that, yes, he's a king as the people are crying out, but a completely different kind of king.
Well, we were warned, just to throw something into the mix right at the beginning in the Magnificat, right at the beginning of Luke, that we're going to have a very upside down world. And this is getting really, really upside down. So very challenging right from the start. Bishop Steve, challenging for you in this passage?
Yeah, I think the whole passage is challenging, actually, from the word go right to the very end. Again, the big challenge for me results as a result of a penny drop moment I had earlier on this year when I was thinking, actually, I don't have to make any excuses for Jesus. Jesus is who he is. And realizing I don't have to explain away or whatever actually made quite a lot of sense to me. And now I'm looking in terms of challenges. Here comes Jesus. And as Gillian's just said, it's not the conventional image of a king, but Jesus is coming to Jerusalem, his place, as king. And because it's not the sort of king that we today in the 20th century would understand anyway, or as it was in those days, does that really matter? He's coming as king. And then do I fit around his kingship, or do I seek to make him fit into my idea of kingship? So that's one of the challenges I've had. I could have more later.
That's a very good one. And we don't really want to be molding Jesus, I suspect, in our preferred image, although we possibly all tend to do it. Damon, for you, some challenges here.
There's lots of challenges here, Michael, and the bishop was just saying that that's just in relation to this passage, but actually Luke has lots of challenges in it throughout. As a bishop's companion program, our group has found that on many occasions. And one of the things that I find quite challenging about this particular passage is a context. Immediately preceding it, we have a very difficult parable, the parable of the 10 pounds. And it finishes with these words in verse 27. But as for these enemies of mine who did not want me to be king over them, bring them here and slaughter them in my presence. I kind of just wish Luke just left that out of his gospel. I don't quite understand it, but it terrifies me a bit. And I think the other thing that I find challenging about this passage as well is the question about where do we find ourselves in it. You know, we often like to think that we are amongst the disciples, the multitudes praising Jesus as he comes into Jerusalem. But the people who obstruct the ministry of Jesus are the religious leaders of the day. And we have to be so mindful of that in this passage, where do we find ourselves in, and how do we get in the way of the good news of Jesus being lived out and experienced today? We had our AGM on Sunday, and the People's Warden, Nolene Watson, ended her report with a quote from Jimi Hendrix, of all musicians. You'll know him well, I'm sure, Michael. And it's, when the power of love is greater than the love of power, the world will know peace. And I think that's such a profound quote in the light of this passage.
Yeah, and in the light of current, very obvious events. Thank you for that. And personally, Gillian, just a bit of challenge from you for the passage?
Yeah, I've kind of often thought that when Jesus arrived in Jerusalem, it was the crowds that were kind of celebrating him, but Luke makes it quite clear that it's disciples, I think, as Damon mentioned. And I find that really interesting, that here are all of these disciples. Jesus is their hero, and they're celebrating him very publicly and very dangerously in that way as king. So they're really standing up there and pledging their allegiance there. But of course, by the end of the week, you know, they've betrayed him, denied him, deserted him. And it just reminded me, as sort of as disciple, that we can be, you know, quite fickle, and, you know, we're fallible and fallen, and yet thankfully also forgiven. Lots of F's there.
Lots of F's. And we get that famous hymn, of course, then crucify was all their breath. So, you know, we've welcomed him in a sense. If we're the crowd, if we're the disciples, we can decide in a sense where we belong in this scene. But we know that almost everybody except the women run away very soon. So let's talk then about the good news. And as usual, this is a world crying out for a bit of good news. Let's go to you again, Damon. Some good news for you here.
Yeah. Again, there's just as there's lots of challenges, there's lots of good news in this passage too. During this season of Lent, the communities in the Upper Clutha have been looking at some of the artworks of Vincent van Gogh. And each Sunday, we've been picking up a painting and then relating it to the Sunday Gospel. This coming week, it's that very well-known painting called Starry Night. And it's just a magnificent painting of all of creation rising up in a sense of celebration and joy. And one of the things I love about the passage that's before us now is right at the end of it, it talks about how when the Pharisees and the scribes say to Jesus, tell your disciples to be quiet, how Jesus says, well, if these were silent, the stones would shout out. And it just gives us this image, this wonderful image of not only the disciples, but the whole of creation giving voice to the joy of Jesus coming in to Jerusalem. So I think there's just some wonderful good news just in that simple statement.
Well, let's go to you, Gillian. Good news.
Yeah, I was going to say the thing about the stone crying out too, because I did think that was actually quite an amazing little, very affirming, reassuring bit there, actually. But also, the other thing I thought was reassuring and quite good news about it was that in all of this public stuff that's going to happen with Jesus, you know, Jesus, there is a sense there where Jesus is in control. Even that idea of knowing about the donkey or colt and where it is, and it's sort of like either by pre-arrangement or by just prescience and kind of knowing, whatever, or both. And there is a sense where none of what's going to happen is by chance, and that, yes, Jesus might be a victim of these terrible things, but he's also victor, right? And also he's king, but he's going to be a suffering king, but he's still king. So there's like all the political and different contexts, religious contexts that Jesus is going to be subjected to. There's still a sense of Jesus in control in that mysterious kind of way.
Steve, do you want to give us some good news from here?
Yeah, very, very similar themes in there. What is the idea of things that have not been said in this passage, which also gives me some good news? Gillian, you alluding to Was it prescience, or did Jesus know what was going to happen? To me, it gets that outside of my little world, God is still working and God is still acting, and Jesus is still challenging and putting things up. So I believe that what was going on was something that the disciples didn't need to know, but just realized that it was happening, and that outside of the world of the disciples, Jesus is still acting. So I think looking around in the diocese, in this part of the world, where do we identify and see God at work? And creation going to praise. And Damon, earlier on, you were saying, where do we find ourselves in this passage? On the disciples, on the religious? I just put myself so often as one of the stones. I've got about the same amount of imagination and certainly the same amount of energy. And so it's good news to me is actually even the stones, even those with limited action, can praise God. And I just wait for that enabling to allow that to happen.
Well, there's the beginnings of a so what, but I'll go to you again, Steve, while you're on a roll, because it's all very well.
Rolling Stone.
Very good.
Jimi Hendrix, Rolling Stones. We're really into it tonight.
We had a starry night before as well. So
yeah, we did.
Well. But yeah, let's be with those stones and anywhere else. The so what's, the ramifications for us in this still troubled world.
I think we're going back to me, the challenge and the good news all linked together for the so what. And as we believe that as Christians, God is perfectly revealed in Jesus. So we see God coming as King, and rather than looking around the world and seeing power not love, as we heard in that quote from Jimi Hendrix, in fact, we do see God revealed in Christ, but a God who gives of himself in order to redeem others. And how does that affect me?
Gillian, so what from you?
I think for me, and perhaps in my context with young people as well, thinking about who our heroes are. And so, are we looking for the kind of the showy, big celebration, triumphal military entry kind of hero type figure, or who can fall, right? I mean, we have had heroes in the past like Lance Armstrong or whatever who, go from hero to zero. So there's that. But also, if we choose those we look up to, admire, who we might call king, carefully, and it's more about service and compassion and justice and sacrifice. I mean, those stones that are crying out, going back to the stones, and Habakkuk, it's about crying out about injustice and greed and all of those things. So think about who our heroes are carefully.
Damon, give me some more so what, more implications of this. It's challenging stuff. This
is one of those moments. It's a point of no return. It's a Rubicon moment, and this journey towards life that we're walking on. We know that it also goes through some dark places, and this is certainly true of the story of Jesus's journey to Jerusalem and to the empty tomb. And it's true of our world and true of each of our lives. And we just have to hold that in focus to know that this journey we're on is one that is towards fullness of life. And let's live into that. Let's walk these days, and let's not just go straight from Palm Sunday to Easter Day, but let's journey through Holy Week and into those dark places and there allow God's new life to be reborn.
And I think this year we're very aware of some very dark places in our world as well as possibly in our own lives, in our immediate lives. So thank you for that, Damon. Thank you, Gillian. Thank you, Bishop Steve. And thank you for helping us break open this, I think very challenging but deeply rewarding passage as Jesus enters the final days. Thanks for joining me.